The mahogany table felt like a coffin lid polished to a gleam that reflected the predatory smiles of my family. My father, Arthur, sat at its head, looking every bit the patriarch, though he'd abdicated that role in my life years ago. Beside him, his wife, my stepmother, Clarice, tapped a perfectly manicured nail against a thick stack of documents. Her daughter, my stepsister Isabella, was practically vibrating with excitement, her vapid blue eyes flicking between the papers in my face, searching for the tears she was so certain were about to fall. They had been mocking my silence for an hour. "It's for the best, Alara," Clarice said, her voice a syrupy poison. "You're not equipped to manage such assets. The stress would be far too much for someone in your delicate condition." My delicate condition. The mutism they had so carefully cultivated over a decade of systematic cruelty. They had beaten the words out of me, punished every syllable until silence became my only shield. Now they were using that shield as a cage, declaring me incompetent, unfit, a silent doll to be put on a shelf while they carved up my birthright. The papers on the table were the final act of their long-running play. A legal document that would transfer the entirety of my mother's estate, her fortune, her company, this very house, into their control. All it needed was my signature. "Just a simple scrawl, dear," Arthur chimed in, his tone one of forced, paternal gentleness that made my skin crawl. "Then we can all move on. We'll take care of you. You'll always have a home here." A lie. The moment my name was on that line, I'd be shipped off to the quietest, most remote institution they could find. Isabella giggled, a sound like glass grinding on stone. "Maybe if she signs, we can buy her a new coloring book. Something to keep her busy." It's so sad, isn't it? The lights are on, but nobody's home. They all chuckled. They looked at me and saw a broken thing, an empty vessel. They saw the downcast eyes, the limp hands in my lap, the utter stillness. They didn't see the fury that was a white-hot star in my chest. And they didn't see what I was really looking at. My gaze wasn't on them, it was on the far corner of the ceiling, where a tiny spider was meticulously constructing its web. An insignificant creature easily overlooked. Just like me. I focused on it, narrowing my intent to a single sharp point. The star in my chest pulsed, and a silent command flowed from me, not through the air, but through the very substance of shadow. "Fall." The spider immediately detached from its thread and dropped, landing with an imperceptible plink right in the center of Clarice's coiffed blonde hair. She was in the middle of a self-congratulatory monologue about her financial acumen. She didn't notice, but I did. My gaze shifted. Behind my father's chair, the deep shadow cast by the afternoon sun seemed to deepen, to thicken. It wasn't a trick of the light, it was a soldier answering a summons. I commanded it, a flicker of an eyelid my only signal. Nudge. The heavy, ornate pen they had placed before me, the instrument of my impending surrender, rolled slowly, deliberately, across the polished wood. It picked up speed before tipping over the edge and clattering onto the marble floor. All three of them jumped at the sound, their laughter died. For a moment, confusion clouded their faces. "Clumsy," Arthur muttered, annoyed by the interruption. But I saw the flicker of unease in Clarice's eyes. She brushed a hand through her hair, a nervous tick, and her fingers brushed against the spider. She shrieked, a raw, ugly sound, leaping to her feet and frantically swatting at her head. "Get it off! Get it off me!" Isabella scrambled to help, peering at the tangled mess of hairspray and silk. As she did, I shifted my focus to the grand chandelier above them, a monstrosity of crystal and brass that Clarice had installed after selling my mother's art collection. My Umbral Legion, the silent, invisible army I commanded, was already there. Dozens of them, loyal shadow things, clinging to the ceiling like gargoyles. Sway. The massive fixture groaned. It tilted just a fraction of an inch, but enough to send a cascade of tinkling sounds through the room as the crystal pendants shivered against each other. Everyone froze and looked up. The room fell into a sudden, tomb-like silence, broken only by Clarice's panicked breathing. Their arrogance was gone, replaced by a primal, superstitious fear. A falling spider, a rolling pen, a swaying chandelier. Trifles, coincidences. But together, in this moment, they felt like an omen. Arthur cleared his throat, regaining a sliver of his composure. He picked up the pen and placed it back in front of me, its nib pointing at the signature line like an accusation. "Ilara, sign the paper." His voice was harder now, the false kindness stripped away. I lifted my head and looked at them. Really looked at them, for the first time in years. I let them see the cold fire in my eyes. I let my gaze drift from my father's blustering face to Clarice's terrified one, to Isabella's stupidly confused pout. With each glance, I issued a command to the shadows that only they could hear. Wait, watch, remember these faces. Then I met my father's eyes directly. With a slow, deliberate motion, I reached out, took the pen, and snapped it cleanly in half. The sharp crack echoed in the stunned silence. I dropped the two pieces onto the stack of papers, a declaration of war they couldn't possibly understand. I would not be signing my surrender. I would be signing theirs. The memories of the abuse were not a flood, but a series of cold, sharp stones dropped into the placid pool of my present consciousness. Each one sent out ripples of pain and anger. It began, as most tragedies do, with an ending. My mother's. She was warmth and laughter and the scent of jasmine. Her death from a sudden illness felt like the sun being extinguished from the sky, leaving me, a child of 8, in a cold, gray world. My father, Arthur, mourned for a respectable 6 months. Then Clarice arrived. She moved into our home like an invading army, bringing with her the scent of cloying perfume and a daughter, Isabella, who was a year older than me and possessed a casual cruelty that was chillingly mature. My mother's things vanished first. Her clothes were donated, her paintings replaced, her favorite armchair reupholstered in a hideous leopard print. It was a systematic erasure of the woman who had filled this house with love. I was the last piece of her left, and they soon set about erasing me, too. It started with words. "Don't be so dramatic, Ilara. Your mother wouldn't want you to mope like this. Why can't you be more cheerful like Isabella?" Isabella was a master of subtle torment. She would accidentally spill juice on my homework, borrow my most cherished possessions and return them broken, and whisper lies about me to the few friends I had until they drifted away. When I tried to tell my father, Clarice would swoop in. "Oh, Arthur, she's just making up stories for attention. The poor thing is still so troubled." My father, weak and desperate for the quiet, easy life Clarice promised, always sided with them. He began to see my grief not as a wound to be healed, but an inconvenience to be managed. His neglect was a constant, dull ache, a hollow space where a father's love should have been. The day my voice was taken from me, I was 10 years old. My mother had left me a small, beautiful music box that played her favorite lullaby. It was the most precious thing I owned. I came home from school to find Isabella in my room, prying it open with a screwdriver, convinced there was jewelry hidden inside. The delicate wooden casing splintered. The tiny ballerina inside snapped off its spring. The music died forever. Something inside me broke. For the first time, I didn't just cry. I screamed. I screamed at her for her jealousy, for her spite, for destroying the last piece of my mother I had left. It was a raw, primal howl of years of suppressed pain. Clarice came running. She didn't ask what happened. She saw Isabella's feigned tears and the broken box in my hand and slapped me across the face. The shock was a bright, searing flash of pain. "How dare you?" she hissed, her face a mask of fury. "How dare you raise your voice to my daughter, you ungrateful, hysterical little brat?" My father came home to find me locked in my room. Clarice told him I'd had a violent tantrum and destroyed the music box myself. He never even opened my door to ask for my side of the story. The punishment was severe. No television, no books, no leaving my room for a week except for meals, which I was to eat in silence. The silence became their favorite weapon. Every time I tried to speak up, to defend myself, to exist in any audible way, the punishment would escalate. They called it my talking back problem. They told teachers, neighbors, and the few remaining family friends that I was a difficult child prone to fits of screaming. It was a lie so complete, so insidious, that it began to warp reality around me. They were the calm, patient parents dealing with a problem child. I was the problem. Eventually, I learned. Speaking brought pain. Speaking brought punishment. Speaking brought the cold, disappointed look in my father's eyes. So I stopped. First in their presence, then at school, then all together. The silence that was once a punishment became a fortress. Inside, I was safe. No one could twist my words if I offered none. No one could punish me for screaming if I never made a sound. They loved it. My silence made me manageable. It made me invisible. I became a ghost in my own home, drifting through rooms they now fully possessed. They spoke about me as if I wasn't there. Alara needs a new dress, the plain gray one. Don't bother asking Alara, she has no opinion. Honestly, it's a relief. The house is so much more peaceful now. The birth of my power was as quiet as I was. It happened a year into my silence on my 11th birthday. As always, the day was an elaborate festival for Isabella, whose birthday was in the same week. She received a mountain of gifts, a lavish party, and a cake decorated with spun sugar. I received a single plain cupcake on a napkin, handed to me in the kitchen by the housekeeper. Clarice had told her it was all I wanted. That night, they locked me in the wine cellar. My crime had been a look. Isabella had been parading her new, expensive doll in front of me, and a flicker of the old anger had crossed my face. She had run crying to Clarice, claiming I had terrified her with my crazy eyes. The cellar was cold and utterly dark. The only light was a sliver under the door. I sat on the damp stone floor, hugging my knees, consumed by a familiar mix of despair and impotent rage. I wished they would disappear. I wished something would happen, something that would make them feel even a fraction of the misery I felt. I stared into the deepest, darkest corner of the cellar, a place where the shadows were so thick they seemed solid, and the shadows stared back. It wasn't a trick of the mind. The darkness in the corner stirred. It coalesced, pulling itself together, forming a shape. It was small at first, no bigger than my hand, a sinuous tendril of pure void. It crept out of the corner, slithering across the floor towards me. I wasn't afraid. In that moment, in that place, the darkness felt like a friend. It felt like an extension of the silence I had wrapped myself in. The shadow tendril reached my foot and coiled around my ankle. It was cool, but not unpleasant. It felt loyal. I looked at it, and with no words, only the force of my will, I thought, lift. A dusty bottle of wine on a low shelf wobbled, then levitated a few inches into the air, held aloft by a newly formed tendril of shadow. I gasped, a sound I hadn't made in a year. The bottle dropped and shattered, but I didn't care. In the crushing blackness of the cellar, I had found a light. A dark light, but a light nonetheless. Over the next 7 years, my power grew with me. My silent world was anything but empty. It was populated by the Umbral Legion, the name I gave to the beings I could summon from any shadow. At first, I could only manage small feats. I'd command a shadow to trip Isabella or nudge a file off my father's desk so he would be late for a meeting. They were my secret confederates, my invisible allies. I spent my nights practicing in my room, the door locked. I learned I could command them with just a look, a flicker of my gaze, a directed thought. They could become intangible, passing through walls and doors, perfect for espionage. They could solidify, exerting physical force on the world. I had them retrieve books from the library for me, bring me food when Clarice would forget to call me for dinner, and stand guard by my bed while I slept. They showed me things. They became my eyes and ears throughout the house. I saw Clarice hiding cash in a lockbox in her closet. I heard my father on the phone with his lawyers discussing how my ongoing mental fragility would make it easy to assume control of my trust fund when I turned 18. I watched Isabella sneak boys into her room at night, the very behavior for which she had once accused me, resulting in a week-long grounding. They knew everything, which meant I knew everything. I watched them plot and scheme, secure in the knowledge that their silent victim was deaf and blind to their machinations. They saw a timid girl in a gray dress. They had no idea they were living with a queen and her court, a general and her army. I was just waiting, biding my time. I allowed them to believe they were winning, letting them push me closer and closer to the edge. I knew that when they finally made their move, When they tried to take everything, my legion and I would be ready. The snap of that pen in the mahogany-lined room wasn't an act of impulse. It was the sounding of a trumpet, signaling the start of a war they didn't even know they were fighting. The immediate aftermath of my defiance was an explosion of pure rage. My father's face, which had been a mask of paternal concern moments before, turned a blotchy, furious red. Clarice's shriek about the spider was replaced by a stream of venom directed at me. Isabella just stared, her mouth agape, as if the furniture itself had stood up and rebelled. "What do you think you're doing?" Arthur roared, slamming his fist on the table. The broken pieces of the pen rattled. "This isn't a game, Ilara. This is your future. A future we are trying to secure for you." Clarice advanced on me, her eyes narrowed to slits. "She's gone mad, utterly insane. This is what we've been afraid of. Arthur, we need to call Dr. Evans immediately. He'll know what to do." Dr. Evans was their pet psychiatrist, a man who had been on their payroll for years, always ready to prescribe tranquilizers and write reports about my developmental issues. He was their ultimate weapon, the key to having me institutionalized. This was their move, to paint my first act of self-preservation in a decade as a psychotic break. It was predictable, but no less dangerous. I remained silent, my gaze fixed on a point just over my father's shoulder. My legion was already moving. One shadow detached from the corner of the room, slithered up the wall, and entered the phone line junction box. If they tried to call anyone, the line would be dead. They herded me from the study and up the stairs to my room, their anger a palpable force field around me. Arthur grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my bicep. It was the first time he had touched me in years that wasn't a pat on the head for the benefit of guests. The touch was proprietary, angry. He was handling a broken object that was malfunctioning. "You will stay in this room until you see sense," he snarled, shoving me inside. The heavy oak door slammed shut, and the key turned in the lock. I stood in the center of my small, Spartan room. It was furnished with cast-offs and joyless practical items. This had been my prison for most of my life. But now, it was my war room. The rage and fear of the past were gone, burned away by the cold, clear certainty of my purpose. They had pushed me too far. They had threatened not just my inheritance, but my very freedom. They thought they had cornered a helpless animal. They were about to learn they had trapped a hunter. My decision was made. I would no longer use my power for mere survival or petty tricks. I would use it to dismantle their lives, piece by piece. I would take everything from them, their money, their reputation, their power. I would leave them with nothing but the bitter ashes of their own greed. The plan began to form in my mind, not as a single strategy, but as 3 distinct parallel campaigns, each tailored to my enemy's greatest weaknesses, a plan of exquisitely ironic justice. First, Isabella. Her entire world was built on a foundation of social standing and perceived beauty. She lived for the admiration of others, for the envy in the eyes of her peers. Her currency was popularity. I would bankrupt her. The upcoming solstice debutante ball was the crown jewel of her social season. It was where she expected to receive a marriage proposal from Sterling Allister, the vapid but incredibly wealthy heir to a shipping fortune. Her entire future depended on that night. I would turn her coronation into a catastrophe. Second, Clarice. She worshipped money. It was her god, her motivation, her sole source of security and power. She managed the family's finances with an iron fist, but I knew from my spectral spies that she was not just managing. She was embezzling, skimming from my father's business accounts, hiding assets in offshore accounts, and playing the stock market with money that wasn't hers. Her crime was greed. Her punishment would be poverty. Finally, my father. Arthur's greatest love was not his wife or his daughters, but his own reflection, his reputation. He had carefully constructed an image of himself as a pillar of the community, a savvy businessman, a devoted family man caring for his tragically afflicted daughter. It was all a fragile facade. He had allowed this abuse to happen under his roof, not out of malice, but out of a selfish, spineless desire for an easy life. His sin was neglect, and his idol was his public image. I would shatter them both. I walked to my window, which overlooked the meticulously manicured gardens. The sun was setting, casting long, deep shadows across the lawn. The shadows stretched and twisted, alive and eager. They were my soldiers, awaiting their orders. My gaze was my command. I looked at the shadow of the great oak tree and issued my first directive. I needed intelligence, confirmation. I sent a contingent of my legion, silent and unseen, to Clarice's private office. Their mission? To pass through her locked safe and photograph every document, every ledger, every offshore account number. They would be my artillery. Next, I focused on a shadow creeping along the eaves of the house. I dispatched another unit. Their target, Isabella. They were to become her constant, invisible companions. They would listen to her phone calls, read her texts, and learn her deepest, most humiliating secrets. They would be my assassins of character. For my father, the plan was simpler and more direct. I sent my most trusted shadow commanders to his corporate headquarters. They would observe, listen, and wait. His downfall would be the grand finale, the checkmate that would end the game. They had locked me in a room believing they had contained me. They thought they were in control, but as darkness fell, my power stretched out across the entire estate and beyond, a silent, creeping web of influence. From my quiet prison, I was laying the groundwork for their complete and utter ruin. They had mocked my vows of silence, never knowing it was in that silence that I had learned to command the world. The war had begun. The execution of my plan started with the quietest of whispers. My Umbral Legion was ruthlessly efficient. Within 24 hours, they had returned from their reconnaissance missions, feeding information directly into my mind, not as words, but as images and pure knowledge. I saw the contents of Clarice's safe, fake ledgers to show my father, and real ones that detailed her systematic theft. I saw the names of shell corporations in the Cayman Islands. I saw the account numbers, the passwords, the entire architecture of her greed. My spies on Isabella brought back treasures of a different sort. I listened in, via my shadow proxies, as she gossiped on the phone, her voice dripping with venom. I learned of her crippling fear of moths, her secret contempt for Sterling Allister's family, and a particularly nasty rumor she had started about her supposed best friend, Tiffany. Most usefully, I learned the name of the exclusive couturier designing her gown for the solstice ball, a prim, easily flustered woman named Madame Dubois. The ball was in 1 week. My campaign against Isabella began subtly. I sent a single tiny shadow scout to the kitchens with a simple command: find the source of the pantry moths. It located a forgotten bag of flour teeming with them. Over the next few days, I had my legion transport the moth eggs one by one and deposit them carefully into the folds of Isabella's most expensive cashmere sweaters, into her makeup bag, and into the lining of her jewelry box. It was a slow, creeping infestation she wouldn't notice until it was too late. The day of the ball arrived. The house was buzzing with a frantic energy that never penetrated my locked door. Isabella was a whirlwind of self-importance. I watched her through the eyes of a shadow clinging to her vanity mirror. She spent hours on her hair and makeup, preening and posing. When the time came to put on her gown, a magnificent creation of ice blue silk, the first phase of my attack commenced. As she shimmied into the dress, I had a shadow soldier, solidified to the barest minimum of substance, gently snip a single, crucial thread in the seam of the bodice. It was an invisible act of sabotage. The dress was tight, and her excited movements would do the rest. Next came the psychological assault. Sterling Allister was due to pick her up at 8. At 7:30, I sent a team to the Allister mansion. They were to deliver a message, not a written one, but a whispered one. A dozen shadow forms swirled into Sterling's bedroom, coalescing for a split second into terrifying shapes in the corner of his eye and whispering a single phrase in a chorus of chilling, ethereal voices. "She thinks you're a fool." It was a line I'd plucked directly from one of Isabella's phone calls. The boy was left pale and shaken, his confidence shattered moments before his big date. When he arrived, he was quiet and distant. Isabella, too self-absorbed to notice, prattled on about the people they would see and the jealousy she would inspire. As they walked out the door, I initiated the final public stage of her humiliation. I gave the command, and a tiny shadow, which had been hiding in her clutch purse all day, opened a small vial of a specially formulated liquid my legion had procured for me from a theatrical supply store. It was a clear, odorless fluid that reacted to body heat and air, slowly developing into a deep, blood-red stain. A single drop landed on the back of her pristine silk skirt. I didn't need to be at the ball to see the results. My legion was there, 1,000 eyes in every shadow. They reported her grand entrance, the way all heads turned to admire her. They reported the moment Sterling, still unnerved, first noticed the small red spot on her dress and pointed it out, thinking she'd sat on something. They reported her panic denial and how the spot, fed by the warmth of the crowded ballroom, began to grow, spreading across the silk like a grotesque blooming flower. The whispers started, people pointed. The stain looked shockingly like blood. As Isabella frantically tried to blot it with a napkin, making it worse, the thread I'd ordered snipped finally gave way. With a sickening rip, the bodice of her gown split open down the side, exposing her corsetry to the entire assembly. The shock and humiliation were a physical blow. She gasped, clutching the ruined dress. It was in that moment of horrified silence that the moths I had planted chose to emerge. A small, fluttering cloud of them flew out of her hair and her purse. Isabella shrieked. It wasn't a ladylike scream, it was a raw, guttural cry of her deepest phobia realized. She began swatting at the air, spinning in circles, a mad dervish in a ruined gown. Sterling Alistair, already primed for disaster, simply stared in disbelief before turning on his heel and walking away without a word. The social event of the season had become the Isabella show, a spectacle of utter social ruin. She fled the ballroom in tears, her reputation, like her dress, in tatters. While Isabella was self-destructing, I was moving against Clarice. Using the information from her safe, I had my legion create a ghost in her machine. They were my hackers, my digital phantoms. They couldn't type, but they could manipulate electricity and data streams directly. They began by subtly altering the stock market data fed to her private trading platform. A decimal point moved here, a trend line nudged there. They made a series of failing tech stocks look like they were about to skyrocket. Clarice, blinded by greed, took the bait. I watched through the shadow on her desk lamp as she gleefully poured hundreds of thousands of dollars of her stolen money into the doomed companies. She thought she was a genius, about to make a killing. The next step was to expose her. I had my soldiers deliver a package. They assembled a complete portfolio of the evidence, copies of her real ledgers, the offshore account details, proof of the embezzlement, and materialized it inside a locked courier box already en route to the top fraud investigator at the State Tax Commission. An anonymous tip, delivered by a shadow whispering into a sleeping secretary's ear, ensured the file was flagged for immediate attention. The trap sprung the following Monday. As Clarice sat in her office, watching her stocks plummet and her fortune evaporate in real time, the doorbell rang. It was the auditors, two stern-faced individuals with badges and a warrant. My father was at work, so she had to face them alone. Her face, as seen by my spy in the hallway, was a mask of chalky terror. The invincible matriarch had crumbled. They froze all her accounts, personal and hidden. The money was gone, the authorities were here, she was ruined. Now for my father. His downfall had to be the most public, the most profound. His sin was not active malice, but passive complicity, all in service of his precious reputation. So, his reputation would be the thing I immolated on a pyre for all the world to see. His company, Prescott Industries, was holding its annual shareholders meeting in 2 days. He would be giving the keynote address, a speech about corporate integrity and family values. It was too perfect. My legion had been busy. They had retrieved the audio recordings from the home security system, a system Clarice had installed to spy on the staff, but which had also captured years of their cruel conversations about me, snippets of them mocking my silence, planning my institutionalization, laughing about how they had broken me. The evidence was damning. The night before the meeting, my shadow army descended on the convention center. They moved through the ventilation systems and electrical conduits. They altered the presentation file on the central server, embedding the audio files and copies of Clarice's fraudulent ledgers. They reprogrammed the teleprompter. They were ghosts in the machine, and they were setting the stage for a masterpiece of public disgrace. The day of the meeting, I watched via a shadow clinging to the rafters of the enormous auditorium. My father walked onto the stage to thunderous applause. He looked confident, powerful, every inch the respected CEO. He smiled, approached the podium, and began to speak. Integrity, he began, his voice resonating through the hall. It is the bedrock upon which we build our business, our community, and our families. He glanced at the teleprompter for his next line, but the words he was expecting weren't there. Instead, in stark white letters, it read, They know. They know what you let her do. His face went pale. He faltered, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. He tried to improvise, but it was too late. I gave the final command. The massive screen behind him, meant to display profit charts, flickered to life. It showed a high-resolution scan of Clarice's secret ledger with the amounts she'd stolen circled in red. Then the audio began to play. Clarice's sharp voice filled the auditorium. Stop worrying about Alara. She's a non-entity, mute and stupid. We'll have her sign the papers, and Dr. Evans will take care of the rest. Then my father's voice, weary but complicit. I know. It's better this way, quieter. Gasps rippled through the crowd. More audio clips played, them laughing about my vow of silence, them calling me a retard. The sound of a slap, followed by a younger me crying. A recording from years ago I didn't even know existed. The screen shifted to show bank statements from the Cayman Islands. It showed proof of my father's signature on documents that, while not illegal himself, demonstrated a shocking level of negligence that had allowed Clarice's fraud to flourish. His carefully crafted world was burning down around him, broadcast on a 50-foot screen. He stood frozen at the podium, a statue of shame. The applause had been replaced by a rising tide of angry, disgusted murmurs. His business partners were staring at him with contempt. Reporters were already scrambling, their phones held high. He was finished. Not with a bang, but with a whisper. His own whispered words, amplified for the world to hear, condemning him utterly. In the ensuing chaos, with security trying to control the stage and my father standing catatonic, I had my legion unlock my bedroom door. I walked silently down the grand staircase and out the front door of the house. I didn't look back. My work was done. The armies of shadow had claimed their victory. The house was mine again. After the spectacular implosion of my family, the legal proceedings were a mere formality. The evidence my legion had provided was so overwhelming that the courts moved swiftly. Clarice's plea bargain landed her a 7-year prison sentence for fraud and embezzlement. The contents of her offshore accounts were seized and, as they were proven to have been stolen from my inheritance, returned to me. My father, though not criminally charged, was utterly destroyed. Ousted as CEO, sued by his shareholders, and ostracized from the social and business circles he held so dear, he was a pariah. He was forced to sell his remaining assets to settle the legal claims, leaving him with next to nothing. The document he and Clarice had tried to force me to sign, the one that would have stripped me of everything, was nullified. My mother's estate, including Prescott Industries, reverted to my full and sole control, and on the day I walked back into the house as its rightful owner, the silence was different. It was no longer the oppressive, suffocating silence of my childhood. It was a calm, clean, peaceful silence. I had the staff remove every trace of Clarice's gaudy decor. The leopard print armchair was the first thing to be burned. I found my mother's paintings in a dusty attic, and I hung them back in their rightful places. The house began to breathe again. My first act as the owner of Prescott Industries was to call a board meeting. I walked into the same mahogany-lined room where my father had been publicly humiliated. The remaining board members, men and women who had known me only as the CEO's pathetic, mute daughter, stared at me with a mixture of fear, awe, and uncertainty. I sat at the head of the table, in the chair my father once occupied. For a long moment, I said nothing. I let the silence stretch, letting them grow uncomfortable. I looked at each of them, my gaze lingering. They didn't know that with every look, my Umbral Legion was assessing them, plumbing the shadows of their offices and lives for secrets, for loyalty, for weakness. Then, for the first time in a professional setting, I spoke. My voice, unused for so long, was clear and steady. It held no tremor, no hesitation. My name is Alara Prescott, I said. As of this morning, I am the majority shareholder and CEO of this company. There will be some changes. My victory was total, but my life was not suddenly loud. I found that I still preferred silence. It was my native language, the medium through which I commanded my true power. I spoke when necessary, at meetings or to give direction to my staff, but I found my words were more potent for their rarity. People listened when I spoke. They knew my silence wasn't weakness, it was concentration. I ran the company with an efficiency that baffled my competitors. I seemed to have an uncanny prescience, an impossible insight into market trends and rival strategies. They called me the silent oracle of Prescott Industries. They had no idea that my legionnaires were my corporate spies, attending board meetings in every major corporation as unseen shadows on the wall, bringing me their secrets. I was not just rebuilding my mother's legacy, I was forging an empire. I never saw my family again, but I kept track of them. It was the final, satisfying chapter of my revenge. Clarice did not handle prison well. Stripped of her wealth, her beauty, and her power, she was just another inmate. The last report I received from a shadow that had visited the prison yard showed her as a gaunt, broken woman with graying hair, scrubbing floors, her arrogance replaced by a permanent, haunted fear. Isabella's fate was a slower, more pathetic kind of decay. With no money and a ruined name, she was cast out of the elite circles she so desperately clung to. Her wealthy friends abandoned her. Unable to afford her lavish lifestyle, she was forced to get a menial job in a department store, selling perfume to women she once would have snubbed. I saw her once through the eyes of a legionnaire perched on a security camera. Her beauty had soured, etched with resentment and the stress of a life she was never prepared to live. She was snapping at a customer, her voice shrill and ugly. As for my father, he ended up in a small, drab apartment in a distant city, living off a meager pension. He had tried to contact me once, a rambling letter full of self-pity and half-hearted apologies. I burned it without a second thought. My legion kept a casual watch on him. They reported that he spent most of his days sitting in a worn-out armchair watching television, a ghost haunted by the memory of the life he had thrown away. They said he often talked to himself, whispering apologies to my mother, and sometimes he would stare fearfully into the dark corners of his room, as if he knew, on some level, that he was still being watched. He had enabled the abuse for the sake of a quiet life. I had given him one, an eternity of it. I stood on the balcony of my bedroom, the same room that had once been my prison. The night was calm, and the moon cast long, friendly shadows across the lawn. They danced and swayed, my silent subjects, my loyal friends, my invincible army. They had given me back my life, my name, my future. They had turned my greatest weakness into my ultimate strength. They mocked my silence, but in the end, the whole world would learn to listen to it, and I was at peace, I was free, and I would never be a victim again.